So we have a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so at the end to take questions of our speakers and of myself, if you like. John is putting out an open question for how he can take this enormous project and make it an effective open source one. So I have to also put in a plug. We have a Birds of a Feather session this evening after the reception where we're going to specifically discuss this particular topic. So you are invited to that if you'd like to come. All that. So I don't think there's ever been a better and more worthwhile challenge than to take that on. So anyone have any questions? Sure.
You vote on which pub we want.
Which pub we want? Yeah.
I think we were in all this morning.
I scoped it out.
It's at the Flying Saucer, I think. Yeah. Any other questions?
I talk too fast, sorry.
Yeah.
There's lots of activities.
So.
Well, at least it's not my fault if it's not my
Just having attended one of the CBIIT hackathons, kind of my perception to the, like if I was to contribute to CBIIT at this point, the biggest impediment would be basically the SOA architecture. I mean, we had an hour and a half or 2 hour session in which the bulk of the time, even the guy I was with, who's in the Java development much longer than I have, couldn't get it to work. Just setting up like a simple hello world. So do we think that maybe the simple plumbing is prohibitive?
Well, so the short answer is absolutely it is. Doing stuff using this kind of semantic SOA is hard. What I didn't go into, because I was kind of rushing, was that the framework, and this is are bad for the fact that you went to a session and this wasn't discussed or even raised by the sound of it. That the idea is that the only real thing that framework requires you to do to be part of it is to document stuff in a structured way. All the other stuff is if you want to do really fancy things like have a single national source of pools of investigators or organizations, then you've got to do the hard stuff. But to actually play in this framework and be compliant, all you have to do is document things in a structured way so that the problem that the architects tell us is kind of not negotiable is that implicit assumptions in the documentation only get made explicit in code, and then you can't go and figure it out from the documentation. So there's a structured approach to documentation where you make everything explicit in the documentation, then you can code however you like. That's the only thing it actually requires, but yeah, the sort of full-blown SOA stuff is hard for sure. So our bad for not making that distinction.
Just some procedural, whilst you're thinking about your next question.
Tell me who it was.
Yeah. So I talked earlier about the Birds of a Feather session where we're going to talk about taking some of these projects, I2B2 and CABIG and others, and maturing them as open source projects. The Birds of a Feather session we're putting together will be organized by Mark, who just asked that question. Mark, do you want to put your hand up? And if you would like to be part of that, Mark can facilitate that. So go and see him at the end of this particular session. Our healthcare track, looking at it today, I think is pretty much scheduled out. We're going to have lunch in a moment. That's the lunch break. And then this afternoon, we have another keynote session. And just looking through, I think that there are a couple of healthcare talks about SQL and MySQL and tablet-based software for healthcare applications later on this afternoon. There is a program change for tomorrow. For those of you who are interested, I'm down to talk at 11 o'clock, and the subject they have me for is a general discussion of open source models in healthcare information systems. I will be giving a personal perspective of the projects that I've been involved with that involve open source, both in healthcare at Duke and in the projects that we're involved with here in South Carolina. So you have no real topic associated with that, but I'll be taking that on tomorrow morning. So anyway, any other questions for the panel in our group or about the healthcare track this morning? And if not, we'll, yes.
The IHE and the interoperability framework that's in place, as it relates to research and the things that you're doing, do you comply with the standards that they have in place, or do you kind of feed them the standards put in place?
That means.
Well, yeah, because the NIH, I mean, that seems big, and I'm trying to see how that works.
Well, we certainly don't feed them our standards. The extent to which we're compliant depends on how close we are to the healthcare space. So some of our recent working extensions for EHRs are IHE compliant. The research stuff, I don't even know if it's, my ignorance, if it's possible to be that closely compliant. If it is, then I will find out for you.
Okay.
Sorry, not sure.
Well, that's just forward thinking, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, I think again we're hoping that our wonderful open source community will do it for us when we have to make those decisions.
We touched one of those standards, that is RFT, retrieve form for data capture, that Land and Bain has been involved with the CDISC. And we wrote that into our grant actually for the Research Permissions Management System, and it was fine to write about it and to conceive it. When we actually came down to the practice of implementing it, particularly integrating the concept of surfacing a form in an EHR system, we found that we weren't able to do that within the scope of our RPMS project. It's a wonderful idea, but again, we're not quite there yet with that particular project. So there's quite a big gap between the standard and our ability to implement that in the EHR systems that we were faced with.
When you look at the standards and forward thinking, sometimes I think people try to be safe and not the first out there, but kind of fast to follow.
Mhm.
But I recognize that somebody's got to be pioneers going out to do it first, and I guess that's sort of the conversation.
I can say that we're looking for opportunities to use it, and then there was a gap really between our grant-funded project and our ability to actually go in there and start tweaking the vended systems that would otherwise have to work with that. And that was too much for one particular project I was involved with to cope with. So we're at the sort of discussion phase. We want to use those standards, but practically it's quite hard, that particular one. Dan?
I mean,
Yeah.
the only thing else I'd say with the IHE standards is that there's strong interest in using HIEs to support clinical research informatics, but there's also very strong barriers in terms of patient consent management and using the systems that way. So the current barriers of laws we have to navigate through are hard enough just to make an HIE work. Then we want to use an HIE for research. I think that's a whole new field. Now, that doesn't mean people haven't put in a bunch of grants and tried to start doing that. Our friends in Connecticut, who Ian knows, they're spending a lot of time with MOS, which is an open source HIE project, trying to implement the MOS platform as a data feeder into a data warehouse for doing research. And I think that's going to go forwards at some point, and you'll see some pioneering attempts to take the IHE standards and put them into the research context. Otherwise, they're just straight clinical context.
John, do you have something?
Well, I was going to sort of riff on that, the RFD, retrieve form data capture. That's a kind of way of pulling data for clinical trials out of an EHR. And, you know, so just because this is being recorded, you know, we are a member of CDISC, we're enthusiastic partners in CDISC, it's a CDISC initiative, and they have a lot of folks in the pharma industry who just think, well, it can't be that hard to get the data from an EHR. And actually, it turns out partly because of the wall that Dan mentioned, but partly because of other walls that are kind of cultural, it's really, really hard. And that's probably why you guys run out of steam. Yeah.
It was a nice idea.
And we are committed to getting there, but it's harder than some folks think, for sure.
Mark?
This question is more for Dan. Just kind of thinking about, because you raised some of the kind of activism and cultural, just having attended a couple of kind of AMIA and the CA Big Conference, and then attending kind of more like RailsConf and ClosureCon and things like that. What is your perception of, it seems like there's a big, it's two different worlds.
It is. It is a totally different world, and it's a big gap from an incentive standpoint and even an organizational standpoint for a research lab that operates to service both their clinical compartment in a healthcare system and the open source community, that they're just not really paying that much attention to the open source community. So they look at it as they're building things for their users, and they're packaged and they're done. The hacking piece is still envisioned but not implemented. And Harvard, though, at least having been at their internal open source conference, they're paying attention. And so I can't speak to every single institution's perspective on open source and getting Hacktivation running, but they know that if they don't get Hacktivation energy down, engage the community, their open source projects will die, and they're wasting their time. And I think that's what everyone needs to keep hearing, because, you know, that pile of money is going to move to a .org, and they're going to have to start thinking differently, and they're going to have to measure their success both on how many people use the software more than how much money they get from grants.
So what is Recombinant doing to promote that?
We're here. and no, well, to be honest, we have a very thin line we have to walk, because we aren't the academics. We aren't in the same mode they're in. And some of these things benefit us, and some of the things don't benefit their current way. And we're completely dependent on the goodwill of this community. And so we're lightly evangelizing.
Well, thank you very much. I just can't emphasize, I mean, the most important words that Dan said then was that we're here. And I think the very fact that these two representatives of an enormous section of the research informatics community are actually here talking about how they're going to turn their projects into, or motivate or lead their projects to becoming open source is a sea change. It's an inflection point in these particular areas. So it's starting today, and it's starting at Posscon. So thank you very much, everybody.